Chapter 2 Site Forts, Their Typology and Location. Herodotus, in his second book, Histories 30, writes three garrisons were maintained in Egypt at the time, one in the city of Elephantine against the Ethiopians, another in the Pelusic, Daphne against the Syrians and Arabians, and a third against Libyans in Morea. The Ionians and Corians, who had lent him their assistance, Psammetichus assigned as abodes two places opposite to one another, one on either side of the Nile. Each received their name of the camps. He also made good on all his splendid promises by which he had gained their support. The Ionians and Carians occupied for many years the places assigned them by Psammetichus, which lay near the sea, a little below the city of Babastus, on the Pelusic mouth of the Nile. King Amasis long afterwards removed the Greeks hence and settled them at Memphis to guard him against the native Egyptians. From these short accounts by the respected Greek historian, it is clear that the fortifications which were established by the Saite rulers represented an important instrument of protection for the reunified Egypt, as its weakest border sites, and that here was where the large mercenary troops and Egyptian Mamluchai were garrisoned. The military architects and engineers of ancient Egypt gained considerable experience through the long dynastic era building fortifications of various shapes and sizes, which have the status of fortresses, watchtowers, fortified barracks, secure citadels, strongholds, etc. The southern border and the delta regions were, more than any other Egyptian territories, constantly exposed to troublesome invaders. During the first millennium BC, Egypt was increasingly confronted with the powerful and well-trained imperial armies of the Near East. The eastern delta has been the source of many archaeological and literal traces of military structures. From the famous Middle Kingdom, Wall of the Ruler, a series of forts which had been maintained in good condition for centuries, to the similarly sophisticated defense systems of the new kingdom known as the Ways of Horus, which was later controlled and kept by the Saite kings. Characteristic of the western delta was a chain of Ramesside fortified sites like those at el Rachuman, Qom, Ferin, etc. Sadly, the fort in the opposite southern part of Egypt at Elephantine has not been unearthed so far, but is accommodated among other large Jewish garrisons. Traces of the garrisons are attested quite unusually in the written sources found in the remarkably rich Aramaic archive discovered here. Almost as a rule from the Saite period onward, the majority of defense structure stood on massive mud brick platforms of cellular structure with numerous small interior compartments, casemates, usually filled with earth and debris of various sorts. They were situated inside massive mud brick enclosure walls. During the recent decades, numerous archaeological excavations were undertaken in the Delta region, and some of them focused on the sites with impressive late period structures still in the situ, ergo the fortresses at Tel Kedwa. The newly obtained results have inspired the hypothesis that this platform is nothing more than an engineering tool devised to support superstructures of a wide range of constructions, palaces, temples, shrines, houses, etc. And some scholars immediately began to call for a change in the interpretation of these structures from forts to high temples, following the re-examination of the previously excavated structures at Necrotis and Daphne, which rested on a mud brick elevated base, and the comparison of these structures with the military fortresses at Tel Kedwa. Scholars started to no longer interpret these structures as primarily military in nature, but proposed a more religious or administrative function of these buildings. They, however, forgot to take into account many other factors equally important for the precise definition of any structure, mainly its size, building disposition, plan, and strategic location. Before discussing their character and specific design, it would be advisable to describe all structures which could aspire to the designation Saite Fortress. Tel Kedwa. The discovery of the fortress of Tel Kedwa, or Tel El Kadu, was a result of a long-term systematic investigation of the North Sinai expedition of Ben Gurion University, carried out during the 1970s and 1980s on the vast territory between the Suez Canal and the Gaza Strip. Here on the edge of the East Delta Plain and near the site of Tel El Her, a site with another fort coming from the first Persian occupation, Israeli archaeologists identified first on the aerial photographs and afterwards through rather limited field excavation an enormous fortified structure which consisted of a massive square mud brick enclosure wall 200 meters on a side with a lot of buildings constructed along the enclosure wall and in the open court of the precinct. The excavation did not succeed in locating the main entrance, and some lateral gates of the fortress, which they expected might have been on the northeast corner facing the water canal. This gigantic enclosure wall is unique in every respect and deserves our attention and a detailed description. The massive enclosure wall is generally about 13.5 meters thick, but the thickness increases to more than 17.5 meters where reinforced by the bastions. It is built entirely without the usual opening for gates. The foundation courses achieved a depth of about 1.2 meters below the surface and rested on a sand bed. Sun-dried brick fashioned out of the Nile clay and mud were used as essential building material. The mud bricks were of standard size, measuring about 40 or 44 by 20 by 12 or 15 centimeters. On three sides of a rather regular intervals, small compartments, 3 by 2 meters in size, were constructed inside the wall. 3 rectangular bastions abutted the exterior face of the wall and further to strengthen each corner. The east wall, very specific in its nature, was also the thickest, about 20 meters across, probably due to the extremely strong attacks of water on this side of the structure, and consisted in all its length of large rectangular compartments as well as very long and narrow inner corridors without reinforced short crosswalks. The subsequent control excavations carried out in several chambers and corridors apparently showed, similar to the other 3 mud brick walls, no evidence of connecting doorways or floors, nor any trace of their use for storage, dwelling, or other possible activities. Unfortunately, the excavated areas always became waterlogged at the depth of about 2 meters. In one excavation area, a compartment of the northeast corner, however, a depth of 3.2 meters was reached. It appeared that this compartment, like all the others, was hollowed rather like a brick shaft with no evidence of a floor or connecting doorways. All cleared compartments usually contain brick material, stone, and pottery fragments. According to Oren, while the subterranean water is obviously very high in the delta, the foundation of high and massive structures could not possibly have been constructed on already waterlogged sites, and their interior systems, consisting of numerous shafts and narrow corridors, seem to be primarily devised to counteract dampness and provide for proper drainage of enormous brick masses. This would also explain the intentional filling of the inner chambers with debris, which significantly enforced this function. Furthermore, buildings or gigantic walls or structures such Furthermore, building gigantic walls or structures, such a platform entirely of mud brick, required hollowed compartments to relieve the tremendous pressure created by masses of brickwork. The enormous thickness of the mud brick enclosure wall must then be considered to be primarily an attribute of military architecture, with the shafts and corridors having an engineering purpose. From the numerous buildings fairly well visible on the surface and widespread inside the enclosure, only a few were accurately excavated. Despite this, they demonstrate their domestic storage and industrial metallurgical character. The material gained from limited excavation and surface surveys consists mainly of the ubiquitous pottery datable to the Saite period. Its Egyptian, Phoenician, Palestinian, and Greek provenance clearly demonstrates the international character of the inhabitants, which was by no means a local exception. It occurred in the majority of the Saite forts and fortifications. Further found were also stone vessels, faience, small stone finds, and a rich assembly of metal artifacts, bronze, arrowheads, weights, amulets was recorded. Of special interest then are the metal objects, because they're very well paralleled with the finds from Daphne and Necrotis, other fortified sites with Greek communities, where the Greek craftsmen can be certified or credited with the introduction to the rather conservative Egypt. Other fortified sites with Greek communities where the Greek craftsmen can be credited with the introduction to a rather conservative Egypt of the sophisticated iron metal technology known and used at the time, 7th and 6th centuries BC, in the Greek centers. Such a gigantic defensive structure on a flat ground has so far no parallel in Egypt military architectural datable and military. So far, no parallel in Egyptian military architecture datable to the Saite period and discovered on the Egyptian territory itself. Oren's limited excavation did not provide satisfactory answers to all questions connected with its existence. In order to proceed further and to improve our knowledge of the troubled past and the living conditions as well as the development of the buildings, the joint expedition of the Egyptian Antiquities Organization and the University of Toronto embarked on a more detailed and highly ambitious investigation inside an intramural settlement, outside an extramural settlement, and also a cross-section of the fortification. A couple of trenches have been excavated in the most promising and, from the architectural point of view, north part of the enclosure. The collected material of Egyptian, Aegean, and Canano-Phoenician provenance and the building stratigraphy, 5 phases have been distinguished, clearly confirmed the site dating of the fortress in its initial phase, its construction at the end of the 7th century, 630 BC, to the fatal destruction by fire sometime during the second half of the 6th century BC, very probably as a result of Persian invasion of Egypt. Thus, the fortress at Tel Kedwa belongs to other already known structures, albeit they are not as impressive as the fortifications built by Psamtik I and the members of his family. This is perfectly supported by the find of a partially preserved scarab bearing the possible prenomen Menkhepera, or Naku I, Nekau I. In order to unearth a foundation deposit, 2 small trenches were dug at the northwest corner, but without success. Unfortunately, also one of the main aims of the excavation, determining the entrance of the fortress, or at least its visible traces, was not reached. One cannot, however, exclude the possibilities that all remnants were destroyed by the builders themselves while they were digging a moat around the enclosure wall. Fortifications like this one certainly cannot exist without adequate access or even a couple of access routes as we know them. For example, from the Saite fortress at Dorginarti in Nubia, which features two massive gates at the northeast and west sides. Comparing this fortress with the Tel Kedwa makes it clear at first glance that Saite fortresses were far from being uniform. On the contrary, they fully respected local conditions with regard to design and building material. A dominant part of the fortress at Dorginarti is formed by a massive mud brick circuit wall about 8 meters thick and preserved to the height of around 5 to 6 meters. The earliest wall was even crenellated with glacis formed of local stone. Likewise, at Tel Kedwa, the presence of extramural buildings was recorded. Here, the interior was better preserved and divided into 3 parts. The west sector, with the main huge gateway, contained the garrison quarters, workshops, storage buildings, and the central sector was occupied by the official residence. And inside the east sector, with the river gateway, were additional storage facilities. Judging from the complete absence of anything resembling gates in the body of the mud brick walls of Tel Kedwa, it seems highly probable that in each of this pattern of entrance was abandoned and modified into a long ramp, even also constructed from mud brick. However, as time passed, this part of the fortress disappeared without trace as a result of either water erosion or numerous rebuilding phases, or both. The same conclusion can be applied where the approach ramp was constructed from blocks of stone. An excellent example of this visible approach ramp is to be found at the fortified palace of Apries at Memphis. This imposing fortress at Tel Kedwa, with massive bastions along the length of its walls, so unique inside Egypt, has its predecessor in the numerous Middle Kingdom and mainly New Kingdom fortresses in Lower Nubia. It is worth mentioning that the occurrence of this type of fortification on Egyptian territory proper highlights the sense of real danger that the Egyptians felt during the late period, coming from their Near East neighbors. The Palace of Apries at Memphis. This royal building occupied a really prominent place in the military architecture of the late period due to its combination of fortified citadel with royal residence in one unique complex lying on a solid mud brick casemate foundation. The first short description, mainly of the west part of the palace, was provided by Danians. During the spring of 1901, he cleared several internal casemate chambers of mud brick platforms, which were 200 meters long and 6 meters thick. The construction detail of the internal articulation of the casemates with strong reinforcements of timber beams did not escape his attention. Today, only the holes remain outside the palace, but still within the enclosure. He discovered a deposit of bronze as datable to the Saite period. After Danien's fruitful excavation, W.M.F. Petrie worked on the site during 1909 and provided a fairly exhaustive description of his excavations of the entire massive structure in the northern part of the ancient Memphis. In short, his report is as follows. He uncovered a long ridge measuring 60 by 120 meters with the ruins of walls on top of the mound. The walls were executed of still well articulated black mud bricks and a rather enormous quantity of stone was used for the decoration of the wall. The lower lining of halls, floors, doorways, stairways, and was partially preserved. He frequently mentions the earlier palaces, which have stood here, but later research by B.J. Kemp clearly proved, see below, that Petrie was rather hasty. Was rather Petrie's rather was rather was a rather hasty interpretation. By B.J. Kemp clearly proved, see below, that Petrie's rather a hasty interpretation, as goes for both the yielded find and the stratigraphical situation. The structure was a whole belongs the structure as a whole belongs to the late period with less significant overlaps to the Ptolemaic period. He observed that the north part of the palace, so-called Mandara, was extended with a cellular substructure of brick shafts covered with a dome. Petrie compares this casemate structure with the platforms of the forts which he discovered at Naucratis and Daphne. The building itself stood at the northwest corner of the great fortified camp. Along the west side was a line of 3 great enclosures in the palace fortress mound. Petrie devoted special attention to the massive enclosure built to the south, very close to the palace foundation platform itself. There he identified a roadway with 2 wide gates, one at the south and another at the north, which aligned perfectly with the old Broadway in the south section of the palace and led to the great columned court. A fosse dug between the royal palace and the enclosure, about 6 meters in depth, did not reveal more than a traditional way of building in the traces which are still visible. The architectural disposition of the palace was well preserved, and some halls revealed interesting original artifacts, including drums and capitals of columns. With the name of Pharaoh Apries Haribre. An unusual structure was built for the security of the king in the southwest corners of the palace, where Petrie uncovered a system of 3 narrow corridors with extremely thick walls, about 6 meters, which he interpreted as a lower tower citadel. A staircase led to the private quarters of the royal family located in the higher floor. The apparently highest point of the palace might have offered an excellent view of all over the Memphite plain, doubtlessly a big advantage for the defenders, both Egyptian and later Persians, in such a turbulent time. About 70 years after Petrie's excavation, B.J. Kemp, during his 2 brief visits to the site, conducted an inspiring and detailed excavation of the palace architecture and the mud brick structures associated with its effort to supplement or clarify some of Petrie's findings. Although certain important parts had been destroyed or disappeared completely since then as a result of long-term destructive Sabacan activities, others were excavated all the way down to the foundation trenches and provided a unique insight. The enormous palace extensions, as well as the system of enclosures surrounding it, still visible. The enormous palace extensions, as well as the system of enclosures surrounding it, are still visible today. One can thus easily understand Petrie's effort to find the outer boundary wall and his successful identification of the Great Gate of this enclosure in its northeast corner. The mud brick mound was identified by Kemp as consisting of a grid of walls whose interior shafts were filled with earth and rubble deliberately. This filling was covered by a rather thin layer of mud brick, and finally over this the solid limestone floor was laid. The 13.66 meter high platform supported by the constructions on the top supported the 13 by 66 meter high platform supported this construction to the top. All the major vertical walls descended all the way down through the mound. Some rows of beam holes were still visible in the walls below the floor level. The same observation was already made by Danians. The brick casemates, oval in layout and perhaps domed, were probably filled with rubble only to half their height. They were uncovered in Petrie's Mandara, situated in the northernmost part of the palace, and could have explained as much as more solid variation of the previous rectangular casemates, and were designed to support considerably larger and thus heavier columns. Kemp's theory on the building principles which were applied to Apri's palace is evidence in its south to the heavily decayed part. The isolation of the palace from the next enclosure, positioned somewhat to the south by the so-called Petrie's fosse, actually a foundation trench revealed only in this part of the structure because it abutted on the above-mentioned substructure, seems to be the initial intention of the site architects, as well as its crossing by a drawbridge with a berm-like construction. The remains of a massive mud brick wall running parallel to the south wall of the main platform on which the palace once stood are still visible. This is actually the north part of the separate second mud brick enclosure, which had the same width of the platform of the palace and nearly the same width as the enclosure lining to the south. Moreover, the internal structure was divided into casemates filled with earth to create a second platform. Kemp did not exclude that the level of this platform was lower than that of the main one, which is quite possible and has parallels in others, although not royal buildings dated to the late period. Here stood the gateway noted by Petrie, which led through the old Broadway to the Great Court. The enclosure with the monumental entrance to the palace was not the only one that protected it. Others had to be situated further to the south and disappeared in the course of time beneath the modern Egyptian village of El Gabari. Kemp also covered a remarkable Broadway shallow trenches, remains of mud brick walls, which run from the east to the west in rather regular intervals and resemble the massive casemate structure. They are situated directly in front of the palace, and their north-south axis is almost in alignment with the entrance to the palace. Thus, one can consider them to be badly preserved remains of a massive 87-meter wide sloping ramp leading to the mud brick platform. Such a platform would have been fully adequate for the design of the royal palace and corresponds with the high quality of preserved limestone blocks with an intriguing relief decoration. Tel al-Balamun. Mentioning the huge mud brick structure discovered in 1992 by the British Museum expedition inside the temple precinct at Tel el-Balamun, in the northernmost part of the delta, is like opening the proverbial Pandora's box with regard to the currently ongoing debate about the possible function of such a massive mud brick foundation platform. Was it base for a temple or for a fort? Spencer's traditionally meticulous excavation led him to prefer the latter possibility. The site was known prior to his work thanks to another British archaeologist, H. Carter, who considered this building to be a palace, but stopped his work here, disappointed by the meager results, and moved with Lord Carnarvon to the Valley of Kings. The building was then actually rediscovered much later in the course of the clearing of the inner mud brick enclosure wall of the temple precinct from the Dynasty 26, and had been integrated into the wall masonry at the south corner. All hitherto known similar structures are usually standalones inside the enclosure. When discovered, it appeared to be a huge foundation platform with sand bricks and mud bricks measuring on average 41 by 21 by 12 centimeters. Its internal compartment or cellulus was filled with an obvious mixture of material, and the structure covered an area of 54.15 by 61.10 meters. The subsequent excavations were focused on the delineation of a number of chambers inside the foundation platform, as well as on the location and the clearance of the corners of the building, and selective excavation in other parts of the structure. As Spencer describes, the internal layout of the building appears to be symmetrical, which means that the right part, or the northern east half, in his report of the building, was a mirror image of that line to the left part, or southwest. More precisely, the structure as a whole was created by two equivalent sets of compartments arranged on either side of a wide main passage. The corridor was enclosed between two solid walls, each about 3.25 meters thick, which ran the full length of the structure and were at intervals interrupted by several short cross walls, creating small chambers perpendicular to the main corridor. The principal reason of this construction was, without a doubt, to divide up the space into sections for better stability. Their lower parts were subsequently filled with soil or brick rubble. On each side of the compartments are grouped into 3 blocks separated by narrow parallel passages, which must have been provided for access, but only on the upper level. The chambers, 31 altogether, differed considerably in size, which is clear from the plan. Only a part of them had been excavated to varying depths, but nothing, as Spencer stressed, was found that would indicate any purpose other than that of filled compartments in a cast-made foundation platform. The interior fill consisted mainly of earth and mud bricks, fragments of pottery, and limestone rubble, and occasionally yielded even small finds. The limestone traces in some chambers, 21 to 22, may have marked the upper limits of the internal fill, although the absence of any doors shows that no part of the fort is preserved to sufficient height to rise above the substructure. In some of the cleared chambers, a rather limited amount of occupation debris was detected, which can be certainly associated with the new community of inhabitants settled here. This redeposited the uppermost parts of the chambers after the destruction of the original structure in an effort to build small, humble dwelling quarters. An almost identical building was discovered by Petrie at Necrotis and will be discussed later. The remains of limestone casings were identified here and there on the exterior walls of the fort, and we can suppose that at least the lower course of the exterior brickwork of the building were originally covered with limestone blocks and reinforced considerably. The only completely preserved here, I mean the fact that this side was not included in the body of inner enclosure wall or interrupted by a ramp. Northeast wall featured a distinct cavity in the line of the exterior face. This cavity associated with the rising course of mud brick towards the corners, in the characteristic of an Egyptian technique of building applied to tall buildings in the late period and later in the Roman multi-story houses. Caranus, for example. Its presence here indicates that the fort structure reached a considerable height. Access to the fortified camp was gained by the means of a 63.5 meter long ramp, which approached not from the middle of the wall but from the northeast and joined the face of the building at a distance of 9.7 meters from the north corner. In spite of the heavy destruction of the ramp, there is still a slight slope visible along the length. The ramp had a maximum width of 8.26 meters and consisted of two substantial retaining walls of mud brick with an earth infill. The filled gap between the ramp walls measured between 1.57 to 1.63 meters. Judging from the traces on the ground, the ramp walls ended 80 centimeters away from the front of the fort. This constructional gap had been filled with broken mud bricks. Such a method of building would have been the simplest way of linking the ramp to the battered and pan-bedded brickwork of the wall. The mud bricks of the ramp were of the same range of dimensions as those used in the forts. Thus, both of these structures were apparently contemporary. The thorough excavation of the construction revealed a foundation trench of the ramp with 6 courses of well-laid brick and 2 to 3 additionally carelessly laid layers of mud brick for the leveling in the base of the foundation trench. The trench was not as deep as that of the fort or of the annex. This annex seems to be an integral part of the ramp and the fort citadel as well. It is a mud brick building situated beside the ramp of the fort, which perhaps served as a control point for all potential activities which could have been connected with such military posts. Its front wall was about 21.7 meters long and contained two extremely narrow doorways placed in the central axis of the 2 large rooms of different dimensions inside the wall. These narrow entrances and the remarkable thickness of its walls range from about 2 to 4 meters, suggests a possible defensive nature of this building. From the architectural point of view, one cannot exclude the massive walls of this annex carried more than 1 story. The front of the structure was perfectly aligned with the lower end of the ramp, to which it was connected by a considerable section of brickwork. Only the front wall of the annex, like the approach ramp, was visible to the ground prior to the excavation of a distinct surface trace. The rear of the building had sustained heavy damage from later activity. It is necessary to conclude the description of the architectural situation at Tel El Balamoon by mentioning at least briefly the temples which stood there as well. A small Saite temple inside the mud brick enclosure was situated about 10 meters to the west of the ramp and has a completely different architectural disposition on more characteristic of the temples of the time than the fortified barracks situated in the south corner. 2 later temples, datable to the Dynasty 30, have more or less the same disposition. The purpose of this varied building complex was military. The fortified barrack, approach ramp, and annex refer to military Egyptian architecture. Moreover, the complex undoubtedly stood in the most secure area in the rear corner of the enclosure and behind the temple and the living area. The archaeological situation associated with the Dynasty 26 enclosure is a rich source for our understanding and the subsequent correct classification of the site military architecture, because not only the not only the foundation platform of a fortified barrack, but also an approach ramp and a control point ensuring safe movement have been detected. Each of these structures, simply and effectively constructed, creates a part of a complex with a clearly defensive character. Necrotis, the massive mud brick structure known as the Great Mound, which was excavated by W.M.F. Petrie in 1884/5 at Necrotis, is the Western Nile Delta, in the Western Nile Delta, about 10 kilometers west of the capital city of the Saite Dynasty. Saite is certainly one of the best examples of this type of architecture, which is still much discussed both by our Egyptologists and classical archaeologists. In the southern area of the site, Petrie cleared a tremendous mud brick enclosure, which was vastly different in size from the small temenoi devoted to the Greek gods, which were discovered in the northern area. Subsequently, he recognized its defensive character and designated it as a great temenos, which he identified as the storehouse of the Hellenian, referred to by Herodotus 2:178 as a Pan-Hellenic sanctuary. Its inside dimensions were north side 170 feet, 265 meters, south side 151 feet, 259 meters, east side 746 feet, 227 meters, and west side 742 feet, or 226 meters. The thickness of the wall varying considerably from 38 to 62 feet, or 12 to 19 meters, with an average of about 50 feet, 15 meters. It was preserved to the height of about 29 feet, 9 meters. Petrie estimated the original height could have been 40 feet, or 12 meters, or even more. But during the excavation, it appeared that only a part of the southern side of the west wall near the southwestern corner had survived, owing to the Arab cemetery that was created in this area and the houses that stood against the wall. The rest of the enclosure had been destroyed by the Sebakin down to the present ground level, with the exception of some poorly preserved remains measuring between 5 to 10 feet, 1.53 meters, which were still standing. The great enclosure included two great buildings, of which the first one was destroyed, and sadly for archaeologists, it's not marked on the plan. It contained rooms and corridors with the entrances on the ground floor and was situated between the remaining building and the entrance. The second building, which Petrie called the Great Mound, was partially destroyed. He described it as a massive mud brick structure, almost square in plan, 55 by 54 meters, with chambers, both rectangular and square, and corridors without entrance points and communications on the ground floor. Only at the height of 17 feet, or 5.5 meters above the ground, was the living floor located. Petrie speculates that such deep cells could have been intended for storage. The structure still stands to the height of about 33 feet, or 10 meters, and Petrie suggests that its original height was about 50 or 70 feet, 15 to 21 meters. This mud brick platform consisted of 26 deep chambers arranged symmetrically along the central corridor and accessible indirectly through small lateral corridors. At the height of 5.5 meters, i.e. on the level of the living floor, he identified the connecting corridors and evidence of stone doorways in some of the corridors visible were also the traces of two ledges running one above the other around all the chambers, which could have, according to Petrie, supported the wooden floor. Above the partially preserved first floor might have been the second and third floors. Searching for the main entrance, he was not certain where it should have been located due to the destroyed character of the main passage. However, Petrie supposed that it must have been situated in the northern part, since two small rooms for the doorkeepers and the custodian rooms flanked the main passage here. He considered the living area situated as at such a height and having a guarded entrance a significant advantage for the defenders, who could remove the wooden floors from their original position and hurl down stones at the enemies. Because no traces of the access in the form of the ramp or stairway to the building were found, Petrie noted that the inhabitants used wooden scaffolds that could have been removed. On the basis of the mud brick dimensions, Petrie dated the original enclosure wall and the Great Mound to Dynasty 26 and noted that the wall, including the entrance, ruined at the time of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, was newly constructed by this king, and the gap in the entrance was completed with the new limestone face structure. The foundation deposit discovered in the corner of the gateway, lying in a yellow sand bed, helped him considerably with the creation of a stratigraphic sequence of the structure. The same can be said about the finds of marble statues of rams and base slab, and the base slab of small animal figures, of a small animal figure at the entrance, and of a red granite sphinx. A surprisingly small amount of casing stone blocks were found. The majority must have been broken up and carried away in the course of time, and heaps of chips and burnt lime slag is all that survived to the present day. The complex of the great Temenos had gradually fallen into ruin, and additional walls were built against its sides. Petrie attributed the solid filling in the main passage and in some chambers of the lateral corridor of the Great Mound to the time of the Ptolemaic restoration. The level of the floor significantly rose thanks to the enormous quantity of chips and rubbish from mansion shops accumulating here. Mason shops accumulating here. The gradual decay during the Greco-Roman period is well confirmed by the filling of the chambers, mostly dust and rubbish. Only exceptionally coins were found. Later on, the chambers in some sections were filled up to the first floor level, and the remains of dwellings from about the 2nd century AD are identified here. To these later periods belong also numerous smaller buildings, chapels, situated in the vicinity of the inner side of the north wall of the Temenos, which Petrie ascribed to the local deities. In respect of the later excavations, both British and Americans, Petrie's information that he removed a part of the Muslim cemetery from the southwest section of the Great Mound, an effort to prevent its destruction during the archaeological work, is somewhat unclear. While Petrie temporarily saved the Great Mound from further decay, he could not have influenced the almost complete disappearance of the enclosure wall, which really happened when he returned for his next archaeological session in 1885 to 1886. The degradation of the site progressed. The degradation of the site progressed rather rapidly, and so D.G. Hogarth decided to continue in the work of the preservation of the previous excavators, especially after the Arab inhabitants significantly reduced the Great Temenos for the sake of a cornfield. His discovery and subsequent identification, primarily on the basis of a huge quantity of dedication inscriptions on pottery vases of the northern Temenos, as the famous Hellenion, was a surprising contribution to the history of Naucratis. He confirmed the military character of the great mountain and stressed its Egyptian nature. Nothing but Egyptian remains were found south of the Aphrodite temple. He also dated this massive building to the Saite period. The Egyptian garrison was, according to him, meant to keep a close watch on the Greek community living in the northern commercial part of the site. In light of this, it is quite logical that he did not exclude the possibility that the fort was founded by Psamtik I and restored by Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Following, and for a long time, also the last season took place during the spring of 1903, Hogarth dug both in the northern and southern parts of the Naucratis. His ambition was to find the foundation deposit of the Great Temenos in the preserved northwest corner, but his mission failed. He did not find anything that would correspond with the massive thickness of the Great Temenos. On the contrary, the partially cleared walls of the buildings measured about 5 meters. The stratigraphy showed that the buildings in the lower section were built of mud brick described by Petrie for the Great Temenos, but the upper section buildings stood on a layer of earth mixed with fragments of pottery of much later date. From this, he concluded that Petrie examined the remains of the houses inadequately. These negative results of his work on the south wall of the Great Temenos, the place of the Arab cemetery, led him to be skeptical about the existence of the Great Temenos. Relatively recent work was carried out at Naucratis within the Naucratis project. The excavators soon found out that the area of the early British excavation in the northern section of the ancient cities had almost completely become a lake, and consequently this fact precludes any re-examination of the early sanctuaries. Fortunately, to the south of the lake, a comparatively small mound still stood, rising about 5 meters above the modern ground level. This mound, called the South Mound, part of the former Great Mound, was located inside the area of Petrie's Great Temenos, and therefore the most obvious area of excavation during the renewed investigation. The excavation recovered a series of mud brick Ptolemaic structures in selected areas. Among the most promising was a massive mud brick wall, almost 3 meters thick and 9 meters long, in the lower level of the South Mound on its southern side, which ran from east to west. Homogeneous domestic ceramic material from the Ptolemaic period was also excavated. Because of the high level of the water table at the Naucratis, the excavation had to be stopped every time promising deeper courses were reached. The situation was somewhat similar in the northeast area, where 2 squares were opened. During the 4 seasons of excavation, the team found nothing of non-Ptolemaic origin, not a single shard that would come from a time earlier than the 4th century BC. Daphne. The ruins of the late period frontier front of Daphne, defense or Daphne or Taffanes, stand in the eastern Nile delta of the Pelusaic branch of the Nile, in close vicinity of the Suez Canal and the important route to the east, to Palestine and Syria. The poor remains of the building bear also the name of Qasr el-Bint el-Yudi, the palace of the Jewish daughter. Although no direct evidence of the presence of Jewish people has been revealed so far. The site was explored in the course of a single season in 1886 by W.M.F. Petrie, and since the time has been largely neglected from the archaeological point of view. According to Petrie, the character of the yielded material, a large quantity of fine Greek pottery, fine Greek painted pottery, the high quality of the decorated limestone fragments, and the amount of plaster ceiling of jars impressed with royal cartouches, fully confirmed the site's ancient designation as a palace, or rather a palace fort, where the site rulers and his army would settle down during military campaigns. Petrie divided the building of the whole complex into several phases, A through G, the most important of them being the first phase, during which the original fort was founded by Psamtik I. This is clearly supported by the finds of foundation deposits in the four corners of the fort. The massive square mud brick structure, measuring about 154 feet or 45 meters on each side, was preserved to a height of 24 feet, about 7 meters above the ground. Unfortunately, nothing survived from the buildings on the top of the platform. Some of the numerous interior chambers in the best preserved parts show the bases of the springing of the domes in their corners. But not all chambers were domed over. Many of them were filled not with the fallen or washed down brickwork, but with sand, especially the bigger ones. These are apparently linked also with stone buildings or with their remains, heaps of chips. Chamber 35. Petrie assumed that many of the vaulted rooms had an opening and consequently were used as storerooms. The arrangement of these internal chambers is not as symmetrical as was typical for Necrotis or Tel al-Balamun. Petrie noted that the outlines of the chambers had been hardly visible on the surface, and even the directions of the main wall had been found. The directions of the main walls had to be found out. The means of access to the top of the building was not clear during the excavation, and Petrie offered only a tentative solution focused on using a removable flight of wood steps from the northern side of the structure. The huge mud brick structure was surrounded by a rather narrow ditch in places built up by ladder buildings. Petrie interpreted it as a dry moat. Nevertheless, it was in all likelihood the foundation trench. Gradually, other buildings were added to this structure. To the north, a solid mud brick platform, the great mastaba, or pavement in front of the entrance, which would have been actually an approach ramp if we compare it with the ramp of the Palace of Apries at Memphis. But Petrie situated the new entrance in front of the masonry of the But Petrie situated the new entrance to the fort to the masonry of the large square block abutted on the fort to the northeast. A remarkable open-air court was uncovered here, which had a cornice and a fluted molding of limestone around the top of its walls. This block had also another entrance in the east, but only until a further significant enlargement was carried out towards the east, mainly during the period D. The top court, okay. Rereading. This block had also another entrance in the east, but only until a further significant enlargement was carried out towards the east, mainly during the period D. The top of the court in this section, Chamber 22, was decorated with the band of stone frieze, sculptured with the Hankar and painted in red and blue, which was certainly not typical for the decoration of common military barracks. Here, a jar ceiling bearing the name of the king of King Nikau was found. The line of the chambers in the easternmost part of the complex was designated by Petrie as kitchens or storage areas. Judging from the quantity of jars and pottery, they could be entered through a single door located outside the main area of official activities. The most important chambers in this block appeared to be NOS. NOS. Appear to be NOS. Okay, the most important chambers in this block appear to be NOS, NOS dot 11 and 17, directly connected through the entrance with the square block period B and fort. The rooms positioned further to the south chambers 819 AC were most probably intended to function as storage rooms. They had no doors on the ground level and could be reached by wooden staircases from the upper floor. Petrie noted that this block had been built with a slight batter in the wall and covered with a white plaster like the fort. With white plaster. A separate block of rooms, chambers 18 through 29, to the southeast of the massive mud brick building, contained quantities of painted East Greek pottery mixed with jar ceilings of the Saite king Psamtik II and Amasis II. Against the west and the south side of the building, small structures were built whose connection with the above described building activities is uncertain. They evidently come from the time of Psamtik I. Jar ceilings of the king and an abundance of large unsealed jars, lids, and pieces of plaster ceilings were found in the chamber 8. Chamber 1 in the northeast corner of the fort is interesting from the architectural point of view because it contains a recess in each of its four corners. Many structures all around the fort or even inside, which in the case with the large northern chamber, were recessed, and it is difficult to identify this architectural component as strictly a functional or decorative element. The preserved height of the fort reached the structure lying against the south side of the fort. They were full of stone chips, and chamber 12 was entirely filled with sherds. Their function is uncertain, especially in respect of the fact that the main and most important structure, including the entrance, were situated in the north. They might reflect the situation on this side of the top of the mud brick platform where numerous limestone buildings were erected. The camp was surrounded by a massive mud brick wall measuring about 380 by 640 meters with a gateway in the north part, but Petrie could not trace it on the surface because it had been completely erased down to the ground due to the inundation. He did not manage to find any foundation deposits. The only way to detect them was to follow this cessation of a strewing of pottery on its inner side and the cessation of stone chips on its outer side. Petrie made an important observation about the northern corner of the camp, where a quantity of stone chips of basalt, granite, sandstone, and limestone were discovered. This was the likely location of a building of high significance for the life of the fort/palace. Outside the wall, Petrie discovered a great sandstone stela, probably of Psamtik I. Further away to the southeast, he found numerous buildings inhabited by workmen and the armory of the camp. These buildings yielded hundreds of iron and bronze arrowheads, as well as iron and copper slag. From the iron pylon, from the stone pylon that probably stood at the south wall of the camp, only heaps of chips remain, which were found all over the palace and confirmed that the stone was widely used by the builders not only for the final cover of some buildings, but perhaps also as building material proper. Tel Abu Sifa, about 20 kilometers southwest of the fortress of Tel Kedwa, the last so far unearthed structure, is located where the cellular pattern foundation platform was evidently used. It is the Saite/Persian fort of Tel Abu Sifa, or Abu Sifa. Unfortunately, no final results on the ongoing Egyptian excavation have been provided by the excavators, but the visible outlines of a network of quite large castmates undoubtedly suggests its monumental character and importance. Discussion. This description of a large mud brick structure will create a base for a discussion about buildings which are or have been so far obviously cited in literature as forts or specific types of military structure, unlike the lesser buildings falling into other categories, the pure stone house or Shena Wab, formerly designated as a high temple or Pipitural temple or peripteral temple, which will be discussed together with a wide range of other buildings found in the following chapter. The fact that our overview of the military buildings starts with the only real fortress of Saite, Egypt, at Tel Kedwa is not, of course, a mere chance. On the contrary, this huge mud brick construction, well arranged to defy the attack of the enemies and providing quite comfortable living conditions for the Egyptian soldiers and numerous troops of mercenaries as well as other people living inside, represents a widely respected fortress pattern. It has held this position ever since its discovery, together with the fortress of Ginarti in Nubia. Although their design can hardly be considered identical, each of them simply use at maximum the local topography because of the effectiveness of each defense system at its highest appreciated device. Because the effectiveness of each defense system is its highest appreciated device, and is obviously demonstrated by the need for long investments. It would be interesting to know how long the siege of this tremendous fortress by the well-organized Persian army could have lasted. The archaeological remains are insufficient in this respect. We only know that the fortress has been burnt in the end. The pictorial sources, so colorful and suggestive on the wall of the New Kingdom's temples and palaces, are in the case of the Saite rulers entirely silent. Here much still remains to be elucidated. As was mentioned above, topographically, Tel Kedwa follows in the nature and partially in the function the gigantic military fortress, the gigantic military fortresses known from the previous periods, which are well documented both from archaeological excavations and textual and pictorial evidences, but had been established on the subjugated territories as for example in Nubia. Tel Kedwa thus mirrored the fact that Egypt was threatened by serious danger from the northeast, as the published results of Oren's and Redford's team show. The Saite fortress at Tel Kedwa was, despite its impressive dimensions and fairly exceptional industrial base, a site where all activities had been stopped after the intentional Persian destruction during the second half of the 6th century BC. It seems that during its more than 100-year-long history, the Saite fortress and its surroundings changed significantly at least twice following the destruction. The impressive rebuilding plans after the last destruction focused on work linked with the present walls and on digging a moat around the wall of the fort except for the thickest base side. But they were actually never fully utilized. We can only guess that the reason for such an ultimate decision was. We can only guess what the reason for such an ultimate decision was. In any case, a long military memory of this area continued in the new Persian fort constructed at a short distance to the south of Tel El Hur. There is not much that can be added about the palace of Apries at Memphis. The preserved remains have been described by Daninos, Petrie, and recently by Kemp. Arnold could not possibly leave out this building in his comprehensive book mapping the architecture of the last pharaohs either. He accurately depicted the development of the fort into a representative royal palace. It belongs among the small number of buildings from the late period that still stand. Its height and extension are sufficient to confirm fairly clearly the specific building technique of a level mud brick platform adopted for the royal architecture. The fortified citadel of Apries, together with the associated mercenary camp inside the enclosure, could have offered its prominent inhabitants a sense of security. Topographically, it has no parallel so far and forms a category of its own, mainly owing to the fact that the royal architecture from the Saite capital was almost completely destroyed in ancient times. In his analysis of the urban fortification of the Egyptian cities during the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period B, Kemp pointed out that surprisingly a very small part of them, especially in the Delta region, had been sufficiently fortified, especially at places where the natural barrier was minimal. It's probably true, albeit several exceptions exist, such as the former capital Tanis, with its well-fortified town walls, and the temple precinct of Amun, Hermopolis, Mendes, and Tel El Maskuta. Other large and small fortifications have been archaeologically detected in Middle and Upper Egypt. Massive mud brick enclosure walls surrounding the whole territory of the city were probably not so much used for defensive purposes after the unification of Egypt and the expulsion of the Assyrians and the Cushites. The previously mentioned Necrotis and Daphne were excellent examples of cities without town walls, but with an imposing inner enclosure. Moreover, under the Saite dynasty, the majority of the really serious battles had been undertaken outside Egypt, or the attack had been stopped far enough from the frontier. The Saite rulers might have preferred to build a smaller, well-fortified area enclosure inside which they concentrated high state representatives, i.e. the administration, the permanently garrisoned military troops, making a fortified barracks, Spencer's designation, or citadels. Rereading. The Saite rulers might have preferred to build a smaller, well-fortified area or enclosure, inside which they concentrated high state representatives, i.e. the administration, the permanently garrisoned military troops, making a fortified barracks, Spencer's designation, or citadels, camps designation, and of course also temples. Private houses described by Petrie and Kemp were very similar to the citadels in design, but certainly not in size, and come from a later period. A. Lawrence designated these structures as great cantonment, with the headquarters of the Egyptian army, in which the headquarters of the Egyptian army were located. Scholars agree in general on the classification of the structures at Tel Kedwa fortress and Memphis fortified palace, because their very characteristic layout does not leave space for any discussion. The problem starts with the massive mud brick casemates foundations, which are not so specific in nature and function, although they also display many identical features which have already been described within the framework of every particular structure, and which made the excavators designate them as forts, or at least as defensive structures. Their dating to the Saite period is confirmed by the discovery of the foundation deposits in the name of the king Psamtik I at Daphne, found by Petrie under the corners of the fort, and the discovery of at Tel al-Balamun, where they were found lying under the corner of the small Saite temple C, stratigraphically connected with the nearby standing fortified barrack. At Naucratis, no Egyptian material can supposedly be dated to this period. The only significant but post-Saite artifice found inside the Great Temenos being the famous round-top black granite stela of Nectanebo I, bearing important information about tax duties directly connected with the commercial activities of the Greek community long before the Ptolemaic era. Reading part of the stela. Regal year 1, month 12, day 13 of the majesty of Horus, mighty-handed, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, two ladies who benefit the two lands. Two ladies who benefit the two lands. Horus on the side Ombite, who does what the gods desire. Kefperkana, Kefperkariai, son of Rai, Nectanebus, even living, beloved of Neat, and his majesty said, let there be given a tenth of the gold and silver of timber of the worked wood and everything which comes from the Greek sea, and all goods which are reckoned to the king's domain in the city called Hanue Hint, and b the tenth of gold and of the silver, and all things which are produced in Pi Emroi, called Naucratis, on the bank of Anu, and which are reckoned to the king's domain, to be a temple endowment of my mother Neith for all time, in excess of what has existed formerly. This absence of substantial quantities of late period material is fully acceptable when we take into account the really intensive building activities on the platform from the Greco-Roman period through the Coptic era to the installation of the Muslim cemetery. The surviving mud brick remains of architecture can be considered more important than the finds and correspond perfectly with the site layout of the citadel at Tel al-Balamun. There is no doubt that both were constructed according to the, at the time, common and widely used pattern. In the light of these facts, it is somewhat short-sighted to base the dating of the mud brick platform to the Ptolemaic period based on the filling of the castmates. It is generally known that such mixed material can obviously come from secondary activities when the building decayed and was widely accessible to all newcomers. In the course of this gradual degradation, some castmates could have been cleared by groups of new inhabitants and resettled, with all consequences, such as the occurrence of large quantities of intrusive material of the various types, and date even at the lowermost levels. For Tel al-Balamun, Spencer mentions even the presence of lime kilns, which stood on top of the platform. Which, with the Ptolemaic period, came the revitalization of the building program of Necrotis, which included, next to the possible construction of the temple of Amun-Ra of Batet, also a large enclosure wall, which could have been rebuilt by Ptolemy II Philadelphus, as the foundation deposit under the corner of the gate suggests. In connection with the possible existence of Amun-Ra Batet temple, within the enclosure, J. Yoyote came up with the idea that the mud brick structure might have been a palace where rituals connected with the royal ancestor cult started and then continued in the temple itself. This does not, however, contradict the common understanding of the pre-Ptolemaic dating of the mud brick complexes, since the initial site enclosure, which probably disappeared in the Hellenistic era, the long period of time between about the middle 6th and the first half of the 3rd century BC, the time of the Ptolemaic restoration, supports this hypothesis. Could have been simply replaced by the builders who did not necessarily observe precisely the same alignments. Tanis is a case in point, and so is Tel al-Balamun, where the remains of the site enclosure have been surrounded by another later enclosure from the Dynasty 30, which was situated quite close to the older one. Judging from this Hogarth's doubts about the presence of an enclosure in the southern part of Necrotis appears premature. There certainly are many objections to the work of Petrie, but he could hardly be incorrect in his identification of such an mass of bricks. Should that be the case, the gate of Ptolemy II would have had no purpose, as Spencer accurately sketched. Rereading. Should that be the case, the gate of Ptolemy II would have had no purpose, as Spencer accurately sketched. As was already mentioned above, the solid mud brick casemate cellular foundation platforms became during the late period onwards highly preferred, based on top of which various types of buildings were constructed. However, other techniques have been documented. This chapter aims to examine the larger types and find their military raison d'etre. This chapter aims to examine the larger types and find their military raison d'etre, which was discussed only briefly by C. Traunecker and A. J. Spencer, both authors examined primarily small casemate structures supporting a variety of religious and cultic buildings, which were in regular practical use: pure storehouses, chapels, bark stations, etc. In the concluding parts of their article, the most significant larger structures are those at the Necrotis and Tel Al Balamun, and their close affinities are clear not only in their layout but also in their size. The dimensions of these monuments are almost identical. The Necrotis space measures about 54 by 55 meters, and the one at Tel Al Balamun 61 by 54 meters. No temple built on the mud brick base, let alone a chapel, had such dimensions. The height of the base is also different. The casemate structure and at the Necrotis, Tel Balamun, and Daphne are significantly higher, and adequate height plays a very important defensive role here. So does the long approach ramp, which forms an integral part of this type of fortification. For comparison, the approach ramp of the smaller mud brick foundation platform was usually 7 to 10 meters long and rose to a height of which varied between 1.6 to 4.5 meters. Here, a long, high ramp would be present purely for reasons of vanity and ambition. The length of the approach ramp at Tel Al Balamun reached 63.5 meters, and the height is not known. But the base on clear similarities between Necrotis and Tel Al Balamun, we can suppose that the elevated living area started at a height of 5.2 meters or more. Spencer argues a more secure access to the fortification would have been provided by locating the ramp closer to the corner instead of putting it at the center of the wall, which is common for temples and other small types of shrines, and which the processions went directly to the central shrine with the statue of the main god inside. At Tel Al Balamun, the ramp was situated behind the small Saite temple and was almost completely protected by it. At Necrotis, the citadel stood alone within the enclosure, and Petrie suggested that the approach ramp led to the middle of the north wall. His hypothesis was primarily based on the layout of the interior. The central corridor is flanked by the rooms of guardians, but it seems, however, that this location is not sure and that the ramp could have been situated even as also closer to the corner. This idea can never be verified, and the same goes for classifying another already briefly mentioned but disappeared casemate mud brick building lying in its vicinity closer to the entrance. The design of the mud brick foundation platform at Daphne appears quite different in first glance. Here the casemates are arranged irregularly in several rows with larger portions of compact mud brick mass. This arrangement shows a very close parallel with the platform foundation of the Hyksos fortress built near the site of Esbet Helmi and was designated as a palatial fortress by its excavators. The military character of this site is strongly supported both by the inscriptions on a larger stela which was found by Petrie, thy mother, reading the stele. Thy mother, Neith of the temple of Sais, came to thee to conduct the Nile, giving life to thy soldiers. The king made a great sacrifice and a great offering to all the gods of this land and performed the service of giving disability, purity, and eternity. And the detection of an armory in the southeast corner of the enclosure with hundreds of iron and bronze arrowheads found in its bottom part. The iron and copper slag indicates that the arrowheads could have been produced locally by the Greek community, which undoubtedly used the imported Greek pottery found inside the precinct. The military nature of this site and the presence of foreigners, mainly Greeks, here are in the close vicinity, has been questioned recently, and Daphne was designated as a common Egyptian city, which is certainly was not. Firstly, the armory, with a large quantity of military artifacts all around it, did not belong to the common equipment of every Egyptian town. Should such a town have been fortified with enormous mud brick enclosures, which housed a group of massive, well defensible buildings with contingents and mercenaries, then it would sound logical. Secondly, the amount of Greek pottery discovered inside the enclosure, and with respect to this much, we must keep in mind also the so-called situal, which was produced in this area, is too large for Daphne to be considered only to function as an intermediate stage towards the main Greek market at Necrotis. Moreover, the differences in the range of pottery found at Daphne and Necrotis clearly suggest that both sides had an independent market strategy. The numerous indications of the presence of flourishing foreign communities of a flourishing foreign community, both military and commercial, at Daphne makes it possible to accept Leclerc's hypothesis. Leclerc's hypothesis based primarily on not quite clear satellite image on a based primarily on a not quite clear satellite image, which interpreted Petrie's fort/palace as one or two temples. Only new archaeological excavations can shed more light on the character and function of the architectural remnants. Daphne became strategically important at the end of the reign of Psamtik I, a somewhat unexpected finding that is supported by the fact that his embalming house was found nearby. Perhaps the king used this fortification, quite large, secure, and comfortable, when organizing his last expedition against the Babylonians, during which he died, as Petrie mentioned in connection with another site. Several compartments of the mud brick platform were vaulted or domed, like those in the northern part of the palace of Apries at Memphis, and their filling was composed largely of sand, and so they were able to support heavy columns and did not feature connecting corridors. These facts could indicate that the living area above the foundation base could have had a quite imposing layout, not unlike a palace. The interpretation of this structure was and still is rather complicated, as can be seen in von Bissing's study. He interpreted this structure as a storehouse of a temple. Spencer suggested the situation was different in respect of the living area above the base in the fortified barrack/citadel at Tel El Balamun and Necrotis. In the latter, a relatively well-preserved upper layer of structure clearly demonstrated the layout of the living area changed only insignificantly in respect of its base, and that the main load-bearing wall would rise uninterrupted throughout the structure. The main load-bearing walls would rise uninterrupted throughout the structure. A lot of ink had been used from the time of Herodotus onwards by scholars attempting to accurately locate the site military structures. Looking closely at the map of Egypt, we can not ignore the highly strategic location of all hitherto mentioned buildings. The eastern part, with the most threatened routes along the Pelusec branch of the Nile, was guarded by the tremendous fortresses at Tel Kedwa, where well-trained troops of mercenaries were stationed. The vast and comfortable citadel palace The citadel slash palace of Daphne was situated further in the country's interior. Possible attacks from the north could have been stopped using the secure citadel with a massive enclosure wall at Tel Al Balamun, and the western border with Cyrenaica was protected by the fort at Marais or Maria, and the citadel at Necrotis, which prior to the glorious commercial history, as a sole Greek emporium in Egypt, could have functioned as an important Saite military base. Conclusion. Of course, the size and building layout of citadels described in an outline is subsequently discussed in this chapter. Of course, the size and building layout of the citadels described in an outline and subsequently discussed in this chapter are incomparable with the large fortress at Tel Kedwa or Dorginarti, the true masterpieces of the site engineers of the time. But the citadels also possess military features such as secure, sufficiently elevated buildings as well and well-fortified mud brick barracks, which perfectly combine with the administrative and defensive functions. The state administration, the governors, officials of various ranks, the military force, or the local police that resided in these buildings were certainly linked with the military strategy of the king, and the central government of Memphis held it responsible for the smooth function of the civil, commercial, and security/military spheres. These fortified structures were intended to serve as strongholds defending the Egyptian frontier and accommodate inside their walls garrisons of paid and loyal military troops, which were obviously stationed in secure quarters at places that were very important from a strategic point of view. It is natural that they were threatened by armies of invaders because they could not have been bypassed owing to the swampy nature of the delta. Little is known about the military life inside the forts or citadels, especially during the late period, where a large portion of the garrison soldiers consisted of Ionian, Carian, Jewish, and Phoenician mercenaries with their own pattern of organization and customs. Of particular interest is the fact that the construction of all the above examined buildings were initiated and executed by the founder of the Saite Dynasty, Psamtik I, following a period of disorder when individual protection of the local kingdoms took priority over the security of the state, and the security of the country was managed through the building and maintenance of efficient chain of a wide range of fortifications, from a simple fortified station to massive fortresses. We need to tread cautiously though, because Pianki's famous record, the victory seal describing his conquest of Egypt, mentions in many places the existence of at least 19 fortified towns in Middle Egypt and in the Delta, which were well protected by walls. Reading Pianki's victory stela. His Majesty sailed to the north, to the entrance to the canal beside Rehoni, and found Per Sekhamperi, with its wall raised, its gates closed, and filled with all kinds of fighters at the Lower Egypt. His Majesty sailed north. He found Mer Atum, the house of Sankor, lord of Sehedj, closed and unapproachable. It had resolved to fight. Fear of his grandeur sealed their mouth. His Majesty sent them, saying, "Look, 2 ways are before you. Choose as you wish. Open, you live. Close, you die. My Majesty will not pass by a closed town." Then they opened immediately. His Majesty entered the town. He sacrificed to Menhi, foremost of Sehij. Its treasury was allocated to the treasury. Its granary was its granary as endowment to Amun in Impuet Sut. His Majesty sailed north to Itjitawa. He found the rampart closed, the walls filled with valiant troops of Lower Egypt. Then they opened the gates and threw themselves on their bellies before His Majesty, saying to His Majesty, "Your father gave you this heritage. Yours are the two lands. Yours, those in it. Yours is all that is on earth." His Majesty went to offer a great sacrifice to the gods of this town, oxen, short-horned fowls, and everything good and pure. Its storehouses were allocated to the treasury. Its granary was an endowment to his father Amen-Ra. This quite conciliatory phraseology contrasts with regular and merciless raids of the Kushite kings to the north, where they face permanent hostility on two fronts until they were expelled by the Saites. Taking into account all hitherto discussed facts, there is no reason for any radical reevaluation of the large mud brick structures. Although they are not forts in the full sense of the word, but rather secure citadels, it is difficult to imagine them as temples or palaces, especially when they are situated in locations where the existence of fortified buildings with strong garrisons was fundamental to the external and internal security of the Saite Egypt, almost permanently threatened by armies from the Near East. Chapter 3, Pure storehouses and other structures. When discussing the advantage of a mud brick casemate foundation as a common feature of ancient Egyptian building technique during the later periods, first millennium BC, it needs to be noted that the structure which stood upon these elevated foundations were diverse as goes for their nature and function. Many of them have been in the course of the centuries restored or even entirely rebuilt, and bear more or less clear traces of these interventions. Thus, it is at times difficult to assess them correctly. Whilst the large structures resting on top of mud brick foundations attracted much archaeological interest ever since they were discovered, the smaller buildings were rather neglected or their function was misinterpreted. Frequently, they have been regarded as buildings that were dependent on the main temples due to the perpendicular orientation to the axis of the main sanctuaries, or as foundation platforms for smaller peripteral temples or bark stations. As a detailed examination of these monuments by C. Traunecker showed, a number of them were used as the pure stone houses, and they formed an integral part of some temple precincts. In general, these buildings shared with the small perpetual chapels the stone decorations of the walls and the presence of internal shrines at the rear. The Shinawab had an important economic function in the preparation, concentration, and final distribution of the temple offerings in everyday life of the temple cults. The purpose of the elevated mud brick foundation platform seems to be rather clear, judging from the preserved sources. They were a very solid basis for the stone-built structures. The buildings which meet the standard descriptions have so far detected a number of sites around Egypt, predominantly at Karnak, Here, the concentration of temples is enormous, and they are, luckily for us, less damaged than elsewhere, and their layout is quite obvious. The Arnold suggests that this Saite, or already Libyan slash and Kushite obsession with building stability, as evidence both through the deep and solid foundation pits and the elevated mud brick platforms, demonstrates a preference for old kingdom techniques, and in part of the so-called Saite archaism. The previous chapter already mentioned that the majority of the platforms of the chapels were rather small in size. They generally measured about 25 meters. The likewise typical approach ramps were about 7 to 10 meters in length and rose to a height of 1.6 meters. The few large casemates platforms used for the Shena Wab of Samutis building within the precinct of Amun at Karnak and also at Tanis were elevated to a considerably greater extent, which reflects their position in the complex. The edifice of Samutis reached 4.5 meters above the level of the stone pavement that goes around the nearby sacred lake, but the elevation above its more immediate surroundings was probably different and not so high. The largest brick platform at Tanis, which suffered greatly from later activities, rises to a height above which varied between 3 and 3.5 meters above the sand bed on which it is founded. Nonetheless, the excavators noted also a significantly greater height of the construction in the central section with a network of deep compartments. Karnak. Some of the structures located in Karnak were most frequently identified as High Temple. Provided that they have been studied at all, the number of diverse temples and associated structures in the precinct of the main temple is remarkably high, and it's not always easy to classify them accurately. It has been only in the recent decades that their widely accepted evaluation started, and still continues. Rereading. It has been only in the recent decades that their widely accepted evaluation started and still continues, combining textual and architectural evidence. Edifice of Samuthis, the Shena Wab of Amun. A huge Shena Wab of Samuthis was built south of the sacred lake of Karnak and east of the court before the IX pylon. There is some uncertainty to the building history of the structure, although a block found here bears his name. It is clear that he only replaced a predecessor from the Dynasty 26 reign of Samtik. This is the largest so far known example of this building type. It measures 45.5 by 55.5 meters and rose above the platform 4.5 meters high. The building, as a paradigm for the Shenawab, can be divided into two main parts. The middle of the front part was an open forecourt with a portico of 8 columns and a poultry den. A small chamber in the east contained a slaughterhouse. Nearby, but outside the structure, a well-formed and important source of water necessary for the preparation of offerings. 2 stairways leading to other structures within the precinct were attached to the larger chamber, which flanked the open forecourt in the west. The inner part of the Shenawab consisted of 3 large independent units accessible through monumental gateways. Each of these units contained a wide corridor flanked with a series of chambers that served as magazines. A shrine with a stone naos, which was used for the cult, stood at the rear. The inner chapels containing remarkable offering scenes, but it is the inscription that are of paramount importance. Thanks to them, C. Trenecker rediscovered the real function of these buildings as great and pure palaces, as great and pure places where offerings were prepared and consecrated every day. Northern Karnak, the Shenawab of Monthu Ra. The building is situated west of the main temple and in close vicinity of the sacred lake. The ramp used for access to this significantly less elevated platform is only 1.25 meters high. Was embellished. It is only 1.52 meters high. Was embellished with a stone kiosk with 6 columns in the uppermost part. The open forecourt was rather modest, with a 4-column portico and small chambers on both sides. The inner part consisted of a corridor with a series of magazines and both sides, and a small shrine with a naos in the rear of the corridor. Here's a depiction. Here a depiction was found of Nectanebo II with Ma'at in front of the god Montu. Generally speaking, the size and building layout of this Shenawab and all others is much smaller and far less important than that of the edifice of Samuthis, but it still fully observes the feature of a Shenawab. The features of a Shenawab. The Shenawab of Kunsu. If the Shenawab of Mantua is well preserved, that of Kunsu is heavily damaged, especially in its front part. The mud brick platform was in this case elevated to a height of 2.7 meters. The inscription on one of its doors leading to the magazines refer to the Shenawab of Khonsu and the name of Ptolemy III, but it is certain that the building is considerably older, perhaps going back to the Kushite period of Taharqa, and was used even during the Roman era. The Shenawab of Mut. The structure is almost perpendicular to the first court of the temple and is without a doubt the actual Shenawab replaced and older building. And it is without a doubt that the actual Shenawab replaced an older building. Excuse me for everyone who's listening. There's many typos in this book. I'm definitely not the best reader, but I hope to improve as this series of rare antiquities goes on. Thank you. Rereading the Shenawab of Mut. The structure is almost perpendicular to the first court of the temple, and it is without a doubt the actual Shenawab replaced and older building, as in the previous example, by Taharqa. The building layout is surprisingly similar, although not identical to that of Montu-Ra. The approach ramp is situated towards the center of the platform, with the stone kiosk in the uppermost part. Med Amud. Only very little survived of the original building. The mud brick casemate foundation and the stone base of a kiosk, which is with an annex and an approach ramp leading to the center of the open forecourt, with the 4-column portico in the northern wall. The excavators considered it to be the first granary of the temple dedicated to Montu-Ra, and later a magazine. According to C. Tronecker, the construction resembles the Shenawab template and can be dated to the reign of Ptolemy III. It is surprising that these structures were for so long considered to be granaries, since it has long been known that the granaries supply the temples had a rather different building layout. The granaries that the Since it had long been known that the granaries supplying the temples had a rather different building layout. Hebis, H.E. Winlock, designated the excavated structure in the southern part of the Temenos as Southern Building 2. It had a square shape measuring about 20 meters on each side. The mud brick foundation was 1.6 meters high and consisted of a high central corridor flanked by small chambers, 8 altogether, and a central shrine in the rear. In front of the doorway, on a massive stone platform, was attached a colonnaded porch with a sloping approach ramp oriented towards the corner of the main temple. It seems that the Shenawab was built in several subsequent phases and furnished with sandstone elements featuring hardly any inscription. Tanis. 2 larger casemates mud brick structures were situated north of the Temple of Amun and a short distance west of the Temple of Khonsu Neferhotep. And like the majority of other mud brick buildings in this part of the precinct, they are heavily decayed. They are designated by the current excavators as bâtiment harampe or bâtiment harampe. The structures form a part of the temple precinct of Amun and have already been studied by P. Montet and others, acquiring the somewhat vague designation on constructions de briques. The first structure is quite large, measuring 50 by 30 meters, with a significantly smaller section attached to the west, measuring 13.5 square meters. Interestingly, both parts are constructed from mud bricks, but of different sizes. They feature the typical concave wall. The height varied from 6 meters to the central part to 6 meters in the central part to 3 to 3.5 meters near the corners. The mass of the building rested on a bed of pure sand, and some trenches showed. The arrangement of the casemates, square, rectangular, or narrow corridors, is a rather irregular communication between them. In a majority of them, the floors are covered with courses of bricks laid in the sand. The clearing did not yield any significant finds, which could be helpful in determining the function intended for the structure. In some casemates, only pieces of skeletons or shards were discovered. Having analyzed numerous casemate structures inside the enclosure in a wider context, the excavators considered this technique to be driven by the need for efficiency, as goes for both the material and human labor. Its ramp, situated in the middle of the south side, was oriented towards the main temple of Amun. The same can be said about the second, smaller building situated on the level of Pylon 1 and of Osur-Khan 2. A building located in such a prominent place within the temple precinct could have been used for important religious or cultic activities performed perhaps under Near Eastern influences. The only building at Tanis that could be considered a true Shenawab is a small building measuring about 20 by 21 meters, featuring only slightly concave walls, which lies at which lies a bit east of the temple of Anta, which is within its precinct. The two above described structures have, according to Tronaker, a very confusing interior arrangement, and their function and nature is uncertain. It is true that the Shenawab had its typical elements, which are shared by all the above examined buildings: an open forecourt with a portico and a ramp with a portico, an approach ramp, and closed inner units with magazines and shrines used in the cult. The majority of these elements are present within the mud brick structure of Tanis, although in a bit confused design. It would be probably appropriate to regard them as another variant of a true Shenawab from Upper Egypt. It is logical that not all brick casemates were used for this type of building, and the very casemate platforms of Karnak, 12 by 15 meters, the Polis Parva, 14 by 14 meters, and Sankara Block 1, 19 by 15 meters, Block 4, 13 by 15 meters, Block 7, 15 by 13 meters, etc., which do not suit the parameters of a Shenawab, were used for various types of chapels. As German excavations at Tel El Farah in Bhutto apparently demonstrate, the casemate construction technique was not unknown in domestic architecture. This is the case with some smaller buildings unearthed here very recently. The larger ones, 22.5 by 22.5 meters and 16 by 14 meters, might have been used as a basis for some types of official buildings, House 1 and 4 as granaries. This hypothesis is supported by their concentration into a homogeneous cluster of structures and the presence of a rather narrow passage which separated them. Unfortunately, their precise function is not clear, although they lie within the settlement. These so far detected houses from Dynasty 26 undoubtedly built in Khmer odds. Okay, this is a large German word. These so far detected houses from Dynasty 26 undoubtedly built in Khmer oder Zellerartig le Miesegel Konstruktionen were later used, or better, some of their castmates were reused for poor burials. This is a practice known from many other sites as well. Mendes. The casemate structure discovered here had been divided by excavators into two groups. The first consists of three casemate structures, which were identified in the southern part of the mound of Mendes Level 1. This group of underground foundations included a number of domed shafts that might have served as subterranean storage chambers. In some cases, room 2 and 3 in the structure A, even the dome roofs were preserved at the time of the excavation. Unfortunately, the filling varies significantly, and it was impossible to determine its original function of the rooms. Moreover, the walls were poorly constructed and cannot support an overlying building. Although structure C was the most solid of the three northern buildings, owing to its denudation of the upper part of the building C and B, it's impossible to specify their function, where they were used for storage, or did they have a structural purpose. Were they used for storage, did they have a structural purpose? The fourth building D, lies in the south and seems to be separated by the northern group. It forms an almost perfect square measuring about 11 meters on each side. It was solidly and carefully constructed with a concave wall from the bottom to the top and reinforced by wood beams. The essential part of the construction was subterranean. with the exception of an exterior living floor between the building itself and the narrow walls running parallel to the north and east edges of the building. It's important to note that the walls continued up above the dome, which present a typical base for the upper building. On the southern facade, a thick coating of mud plaster was preserved. The foundation trench was 2.5 meters deep. Building D housed 9 subterranean structures in 3 groups of 3. The original dome was preserved in some chambers. They were not connected to each other and no traces of doorway was detected. The nature of the filling did not help in determining the function of the building, neither the purpose of thus and neither the of the building either, and the purpose of thus remains a mystery. The excavator classified a complex of 4 buildings at level 1 as similar to those from the Delta site datable to the late Saite period. They saw an especially close parallel to the design of Samtek's military base at Daphne and considered structures A, B, C, and Mendes as mud brick platforms similar to Petrie's Mastaba and the ramp in front of the Palace of Apries at Memphis. But considering the above mentioned recent German excavations, it would have been more accurate to look for parallels at Buto, because this group of buildings show more similarities both in the layout and in size. Moreover, the religious nature of the structure can be excluded for both sites. Tel El Maskuta. The site undoubtedly belongs to a fairly significant frontier city during the Saite period and consequently a well-fortified, albeit not entirely, temples with associated smaller buildings surrounded with thick, high mud brick walls provided a place of refuge because they could easily be defended in times of invasion maintained during this peacetime. Casemate foundation structure attached to the temple was situated with a massive mud brick enclosure in the southwest corner. Already, E. Naville designated it as a very strange buildings of considerable context, and on the map of Pithom, Hierapolis, it is identified as storehouses. His description of the structure and filling did not come as a surprise. These rectangular chambers of various sizes were built without communication with each other and were filled intentionally to the top with bricks and sand and earth and limestone chips. Their function was apparently structural. The walls, 4 yards, 3.6 meters high, of the structure rested on sand. Regular holes are still visible where very probably timber beams had been driven in. The recess could also be identified quite well. The surface was covered with white plaster and a basic element of simple decoration. Naville speaks in respect of the chamber's function about storehouses or granaries of the pharaoh's army supplies, but does not exclude the possibility that the Ptolemaic kings used them as storehouses. Later excavations of John S. Holliday's team confirmed the existence of the Ptolemaic storehouses. Fields EDM as a multi-stored structure, about 25 rooms and passageways erected during the several phases of construction, more than 90 meters long and 2 meters thick walls. The majority of them rested on massive brown brick socles. The team took the earlier naval observation further by detecting sidewalls and ramps in the south part of the structure. The excavators drew a parallel between these constructions and the larger casemates foundation of the Necrotis and Daphne, which in the usual practice at any time when a similar building emerges, regardless of its nature and function. Which is the usual practice at any time when a similar building emerges. regardless of its nature and function. Such a long rectangular edifice, which originally stood upon a foundation platform, could scarcely have been of religious or military nature. Based on a simple comparison with the so far examined structure, it seems that these storehouses were built and located within the large enclosure purely for economic purposes. The Egyptian architects might have directly followed on the proven Libyan fortified magazines structured in the delta, as Theodorus' account suggests. Qasr Alam. Qasr Alam is a tremendous mud brick building in the Bahariya Oasis, which was formerly identified as a Roman military fortress. Prior to excavation, found pottery was examined in 1999 all around the Qasr and inside the wall of the structure. It became clear that the building dates to the late period rather than the Roman. Subsequently, two archaeological campaigns took place on the site in 2002 and 2003. They showed that the building was a mud brick cast-made foundation measuring 40 by 28 meters and about 4 meters high, containing 23 compartments, cells which were filled with thick layers of wind-blown sand and earth, and the lowermost layer yielded human and animal skeletons, suggesting that the structure was evidently reused for the burial of members of a new community. The trenches in the southwest and northeast corners revealed foundation deposits. The excavations in the lower part of the north wall detected the base of a structure lying on the bedrock and reinforced with a thick layer of stone and shards of Dynasty 26 pottery. The massive structure was surrounded from the east and west by groups of mud brick walls. The remnants of dwellings, covering the area of about 33 to 70 meters, 33 by 70 meters. Some chambers were better preserved and very probably had an upper story. The excavation of the east section 2 and 7, showed the presence of different units with very well articulated rooms and courtyards. Sector 7 was rich in ceiling and clearly predated the mud brick cast-made structure. The function of Qasr remains unknown, but the building perhaps belonged, as suggested by a French excavator, to an important domain where the economic revenues from the north of the Bahariya Oasis was collected.
May I have your attention, please? McKelton Library will be closing in 30 minutes at 6 p.m.
Rereading. The function of the Qasr remains unknown, but the building perhaps belonged, as suggested by French excavators, to an important domain where the economic revenues of the northern Bahariya Oasis were collected. A significant occurrence of sealing suggests that there was a concentrated storage of goods on the site, and consequently that this building, lying on a huge base, could originally during the 26th dynasty have served as a storehouses or economic center, which was later partially resettled during the 2nd century AD. Furthermore, it would be surprising if an establishment with such a significant potential for power had no connection with other sites in the fairly dense Saite period network of settlements in the Bahariya Oasis. Conclusion. The main intention of this chapter was to demonstrate the fascinating diversity of smaller buildings resting on elevated mud brick platforms rather than to provide a comprehensive list of them. The types of buildings presented here are far from complete, partly because some buildings have escaped our attention, and partly because it is hoped that this assemblage will gradually grow as new structures emerge from the ongoing archaeological excavations. The study of the Shenawab C. Tronaker proved that revisiting the already known structures which had been vaguely specified and examined them meticulously using hieroglyphic evidence, might bring unexpected results. In particular, Shenawab, or pure stone storehouse, is a unique way combines several essential functions: the preparation, the consecration, and finally the distribution of temple offerings. These activities took place every day in particular parts of the establishment. The open court with lateral chapels was used for the preparation of offerings. The inner group of magazines with a shrine featuring a stone nails was used for the cult. The buildings were accessible by means of rather short ramp leading to the open forecourt. The location of the Shenawab on top of the mud brick platform was not driven by any mythological purpose, but rather it was a further development from the earlier fortified magazine, which were originally widespread in the delta and originally stood upon a high mud brick basement. These relatively safe towers used for storing food might have been adapted later on in order to suit a wider range of purposes. The later numerous small and, from the architectural point of view, modest chapels obviously served a religious purpose, but lacked the parameters typical of a Shenawab. But this type of building was definitely more popular in the Greco-Roman period. There is also a separate group of structures large rather than small, with some somewhat irregular arrangement of casemates within the massive mud brick. They were built within the civil settlement and also within temple precincts, which apparently indicates that they function across Egyptian society. This arrangement fits well with storehouses and magazines with an economic base where the important commodities were gathered and concentrated for a certain time. Their building layout ensured that there was enough place for an effective and fast manipulation of various transport containers. The far smaller and more modest structure detected around the settlement would have been used by people living or working there. End of forts in Egypt, political military history of the Saite dynasty.